Hi everyone, I hope you're all having a great week. I've really been missing my coastal roots in New Brunswick, Canada. And so this week I'm going to be working on a beginner level, super easy, well, I guess somewhat easy, abstract seascape. I'll be using some watercolors, both matte and iridescent watercolors. I'll be using Arches watercolor paper because I'm also going to be using salt, regular table salt, to create some textures. And I'm also going to be using some white India ink. It's going to be a chance to use a few watercolor techniques that are frequently used while creating a stress-free little abstract. I do mention this usually at the end of my videos, but please don't hesitate to reach out via questions or comments in the section below. I always love hearing from you. I love connecting with you, and if there are any questions that I can answer, I'd be more than happy to help. I hope you enjoy the video. Let's get going. I've cut my watercolor paper to 11 by 11 inches and I taped it down to a board in order for it to prevent warping while I'm working. To get going, I first drew a horizon line about 3 inches up from my tape at the bottom of my paper, and then I started mixing my first layer of color, which will be a mix of intense blue and some light red. I keep mixing it until I get the desired color, and I make sure that I use lots and lots of water because I want to make this layer fairly light. I'm going to be creating some textures using salt, but I still want this application of paint to be fairly light and sort of like to represent the sky, if you will. So it's going to look a lot darker as I'm applying it, as you can see here, and when it dries, it's going to dry much lighter. The trick to applying paint relatively even on a large surface is to use an equally large brush and to make sure that I'm continuing to work touching each stripe of paint, I guess, that I apply, and never letting the paper dry for too long before I continue my application. So if I let that top layer dry and then I try to add to it, it would create some textures that I'm trying to avoid at this point, because I want to create some texture, but I want to do that using salt and I don't want to do it with the water, not in this section of the painting anyway. So again, it's important to use a large brush, to have a lot of paint mixed available to you as you're working, and to work relatively quickly so that you can make sure the application is relatively smooth and even and doesn't have any textures or unwanted textures as you're working. Here I've decided to remove some of the paint on the paper using my brush. My brush is just basically clean at this point. I did rinse it in a little bit of water and I dabbed it on my paper towel. So I'm going to the top portion of the painting and I'm putting in some salt. If I had done this earlier when the water was sort of pooling on top of my paper and hadn't started drying, it wouldn't create the type of effect I am trying to create right now. So I waited until I was feeling comfortable that the process of drying had started, but that my paper was not completely dry. It still needs to be wet, just not sopping wet. And then I started adding the salt. One thing to note here is that I'm using Arches watercolor paper. If I've used a less expensive brand of paper, it probably wouldn't create the same kind of textures. Once the paper is completely dry, you can see the beautiful textures the salt created. I've moved to a much smaller brush. This is a number 14 round brush, and I'm going to start mixing some color for the bottom portion of my paper. Here I'm continuing to work relatively fast because I want my paint application to be as smooth as possible. You can see I'm trying to be relatively precise as I'm working here near my horizon line, but I'm going to be doing something, adding some other paint on that line, so we don't need to be very precise in the application of the paint. Once my first paint application is done and before it completely dries, I dip my pen in water, try to take out as much of the color in the brush as possible, and making sure there's still some water on my brush, I start to run it across the paint surface. After cleaning off my brush again, I dip it in water, remove some of it by rubbing my brush on the edge of my water jar, and then I start to run my brush through my painting in sort of a crisscrossing motion. And I do this making sure that I cross my brush strokes at different places in the painting. That crisscrossing motion left some gentle wave looking textures on my water surface. At this point my paper is completely dry and I'm going to go in with some darker paint to darken the horizon line. I apply this dark Blackberry paint only at the horizon line, and then I'm going to use a clean wet brush to start blending it downwards. It's important that I work relatively fast here, otherwise when I go in with my wet brush it will create some textures that I don't want to create at this point. Using my clean wet brush, I start to run my brush across the edge of the paint that I just applied, and it makes it start to run down. Once I'm done with this, I'll let the paper completely dry again. I've taken out my iridescent paints and a clear ruler, and I'm going to start to create what will look like a splashing wave at the top of my horizon line. Here I'll be working with a much smaller number 7 round brush. The first color I'm going to use is called Polar White, and it's this beautiful iridescent white that I think will look pretty special against the matte colors in the background. I make sure my paintbrush is fairly well saturated with paint, and as I apply the paint I push down on the ruler, and as you can see through what I think is called capillary action, if I remember it correctly from science class. Now that was a long time ago, so bear with me. The paint seeps under the ruler. This is one of the reasons why I like to use a clear ruler, so that I can actually see this happening. Once I'm done with the paint application, I take my ruler and I swipe it down on my paper, and then I swipe it up. And as you can see, it created this wave, like curling wave like motion at the horizon line, and I think this looks really cool. Now that that layer of Polar White is completely dry, I'm going to take some Star Gold and I'm going to repeat this process. This time I'm going to move my ruler slightly up, maybe 1/4 of an inch or 1/2 centimeter up above that horizon line. This time I'm actually not applying a whole lot of pressure on my ruler because I don't want a lot of that gold paint to seep under the ruler. The reason I'm applying this gold paint, this is an abstract seascape, I want to create what looks like the illusion of maybe some land in the distance. And I don't want to put too much of that gold over that iridescent white that we just applied. For this reason, I only scrape my ruler upwards. Once the Star Gold is completely dry, I pull out some white India ink and a straw. And I use the applicator of the ink bottle to start applying some ink at the horizon line. I try to apply a relatively generous amount of the ink, but I don't want it to be too thick. So I want it to pool a little bit so that I can blow it out. But again, I don't want it to be too thick on the paper. Otherwise it will dry and crack, and I don't want that to happen. So even before I start blowing out that paint, I'll apologize because my head is going to get in the way of the camera, and there's just no way I can avoid doing this because I want to be directly on top of the paint as I'm blowing. Otherwise it will blow in directions that I don't want it to go. So hopefully you can still see a little bit of what I'm doing. Just know that it's important to be right on top. And that's it for the paint application. And I'm ready to start taking off the tape and to look at my final product. This very simple, beginner level, little abstract seascape painting was meant to be a chance to practice some simple skills using watercolor paint. Let's go in for a closer look. This fun little watercolor project was also very quick and easy. Are these the types of techniques you can see yourself using in some paintings? What else would you like to learn and practice? Please share your comments and questions in the section down below. I always love to hear from you. Thank you for making the time to join me on this journey. I hope you have a wonderful week and happy creating!